Elden Ring has 10 starting classes, and each one of them carries a completely different story written directly into their stats and equipment, quietly sitting inside a broken world that most players walk right past without ever stopping to read. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to take a moment before we get into this to explain why this video exists and how I put it together, because both things matter to how you experience what comes next. For a long time, I found myself sitting on the Elden Ring class selection screen, not to make a decision, but just to look. Not picking a build, not planning a run, just sitting there with all 10 characters in front of me, reading their 2-line descriptions over and over. There is something about that screen that always felt like it had more going on underneath it than the game was willing to say out loud. Each of these characters is described in barely 2 sentences, and those 2 sentences are doing an enormous amount of work. They are not complete stories. They are fragments. And when I started treating them as the edges of real histories, as the visible corners of lives that the game's lore could actually fill in, the class selection screen became one of the most interesting things in the whole game to me. When I was putting this video together, the main editorial choice I kept returning to was this. I was going to stay away from gameplay mechanics almost entirely. There are more than enough tier lists and build guides for Elden Ring's classes. What I wanted was something different. I wanted to sit with each class as a person, someone with a past the game only half tells, and try to trace the outline of that past as carefully as I could. I also made a deliberate choice about the order I present them in. I start with the classes whose identities feel most grounded in the physical world: soldiers, fighters, people defined by their bodies and their trades, and I move through to the more arcane and spiritually complicated characters, ending with the wretch who I think represents something particular and worth spending real time with. The order is thematic rather than alphabetical, and I want you to feel that movement. Everything here is interpretation. Elden Ring tells its lore through item descriptions, environmental design, and careful implication. It does not explain itself to you. It never has. So when I say something about one of these classes, I mean it as one reading, as the shape the evidence seems to point toward, rather than a fact the game confirms. If you see it differently, that difference is part of the point. The ambiguity is the design. Let us begin. The Vagabond. The Vagabond is, in many ways, the most immediately legible of the 10 classes, and its legibility is the first thing worth examining. When you look at the Vagabond on the selection screen, you see a figure in heavy, dull-finished plate armor, carrying a halberd and a small shield, standing with the slightly bowed posture of someone who is used to carrying weight for long distances. The game describes them in 2 sentences. A knight who lost their homeland. Now they wander. That is almost nothing in terms of a biography. And yet if you sit with those 2 sentences, they open into something much larger. Let us start with the word the game does not use. It does not call the vagabond a knight. It calls them a vagabond. A vagabond is someone who moves without a fixed destination, who drifts from place to place with no settlement. There is an inherent melancholy in the word that the word knight does not carry. The vagabond was a knight, that much seems clear from the armour and the training and the fighting style. But they are no longer practising that identity. They have been demoted, in a sense, by circumstance. Not from knight to vagabond by any formal measure, but by the simple fact of no longer having the things that make a knight what they are. A lord, a cause, a home, a community who recognises what you represent. The word vagabond is what happens to a knight after all of that has been taken away. The vagabond knight set is the armour this character starts with, and the set has its own item description in the game, separate from the class description. That description notes that it is the armour of wandering knights who have lost their lords or their homelands. The plural is important there. Their lords or their homelands. This is not a unique situation. There are enough wandering knights in the world of Elden Ring, enough former soldiers drifting without allegiance, that a full armour set has been named for the category. The Vagabond Knight is a recognised type, an archetype of loss that the world has seen often enough to develop a vocabulary for. What does it mean for a loss to be common enough to have an archetype? It means the event that produced the loss was large. It means something happened on a massive scale, something that disrupted the arrangements that kept knights attached to lords, and lords attached to lands, and lands attached to some larger order. In Elden Ring, that event has a name. It is the Shattering. The Shattering was the war, not just a war, but the war, the conflict that consumed the demigod children of Queen Marika after she shattered the Elden Ring itself and was imprisoned in the Erd Tree. When the Elden Ring broke, the great runes that were its component pieces scattered to the demigods, and they fought one another to possess them all. These were not minor skirmishes. These were total conflicts between beings of near-divine power, each commanding armies of soldiers and beasts and magical servants. The battlefields of the Shattering scarred the lands between in ways that are still visible when the player explores the world. Entire regions were transformed by the violence, fortresses were destroyed, cities were abandoned, and knights, the professional soldiers who served in those armies and defended those cities, found themselves either dead or without purpose. The ones who lived but had no place left to be became the Vagabond Knight type, former professionals in an order that no longer existed, carrying armour and weapons that were once meaningful because of what they represented, and now are just equipment. They wander because wandering is what you do when the structure that told you where to be no longer exists. The Vagabond specifically lost their homeland, not just their lord, though they likely lost that too, their homeland. Somewhere that was theirs, a place, a region, a community of people that the Vagabond might have grown up in or chosen to serve. That place is gone. What happened to it is not specified. It might have been directly destroyed in the Shattering. It might have been absorbed by one of the demigod factions and changed beyond recognition. It might simply have collapsed, as communities do, when the larger structures that sustain them disintegrate, and the people who made it up scatter to survival. Whatever happened, the Vagabond could not stay there, and so they left. And they have been leaving ever since, in the way that wanderers do, never stopping long enough for anywhere to become the thing they lost. The Vagabond's starting stats reflect this history in a way that is almost biographical. Their vigour is high, which translates to a large HP pool, a body that can absorb significant damage and keep functioning. Their endurance is high, which means they can carry weight, wear armour, fight for extended periods without tiring. Their strength is solid, appropriate for the halberd they carry and the weight of their armour. Their dexterity is moderate, a secondary capability rather than a primary one, and their mind, intelligence, faith, and arcane are all minimal. Close to nothing. Think about what that distribution says about a person. High vigour means a lot of things have hit this person, and they are still here. Endurance means they have been carrying weight, literal and perhaps metaphorical, for a long time. Strength means they have continued to develop their physical capability through use rather than letting it atrophy. And the absence of any investment in magic or faith or arcane knowledge means that whatever connection this person once had to the spiritual or divine dimensions of the world has either been lost or was never central to their identity. That last point is the quiet heartbreak in the Vagabond's stat sheet. Knights in the world of Elden Ring are not entirely secular figures. The Golden Order, which was the dominant religious and political structure of the lands between, tied military service to theological participation. To be a knight of the Golden Order was to be, in some sense, a servant of the Erd Tree's grace. Grace in this setting is not a metaphor. It is a tangible thing, a force, a light. Knights carried it. It gave them purpose and protection. It made their deaths impermanent in ways that ordinary mortality is not. The tarnished which the vagabond is are those who lost this grace. At some point, the Erd tree stopped shining on them. They were cast out, or the grace simply withdrew, and they became mortal in the conventional sense, subject to permanent death, no longer guided or protected by the Erd tree's light. For a knight whose entire professional identity was embedded in the structures of the Golden Order, losing the grace would not just be a spiritual event, it would be a total identity crisis. The thing that made their role meaningful, the divine sanction behind the sword, is gone. What remains is just a fighter. A very good fighter, a professional, a person who knows how to use their weapon and maintain their armor and read a battlefield, but a fighter without a flag. The vagabond's zero investment in faith is the mechanical expression of that. They no longer maintain the devotional practices that would develop their relationship with the divine. Whether that is because they have given up on faith entirely, or because the practices feel hollow without the grace to validate them, or because survival has simply left no room for devotion, is not clear. All three readings are plausible. None of them are particularly happy. The halberd the vagabond starts with is worth thinking about carefully, because weapon choice in this game is never incidental. A halberd is a pole weapon, a long shaft with a combined axe blade and spear tip at the end. It is a formation weapon, the kind used in coordinated military engagements, where groups of soldiers fight together rather than one-on-one. Individual champions and duelists tend to favour shorter, more nimble weapons. Soldiers who fought in armies favour weapons with reach, weapons designed to maintain distance and control space in crowded situations. The halberd says the vagabond was a soldier, not a celebrated champion, not a lord's personal bodyguard in a close-quarters context. A soldier who fought in formations, who was trained to hold a line or break one, who understood battle as something organised and collective. The loss of that collective context, the army, the formation, the fellow soldiers to the left and right, is another dimension of the vagabond's displacement. Their entire fighting technique was developed for a situation that no longer exists. They continue to use it because it is what they know, but now they use a formation weapon in isolation, which is one of the quieter ironies of their situation. The heater shield is a small shield, not a tower. Small shields in Elden Ring are active defense tools rather than passive barriers. A large tower shield allows you to stand behind it and absorb hits without thinking too hard. A small shield requires timing, awareness, and either skillful blocking at the right angle or parrying, the precise technique of catching an attack just as it lands to destabilize the attacker. The vagabond uses the small shield, which suggests that in whatever years they have been wandering, they have adapted. You cannot always fight in a formation. Sometimes you are alone, and alone a tower shield becomes a liability. The vagabond has learned to work with less cover and more attention. That adaptation is one of the things I find most interesting about the vagabond as a character concept. Here is someone trained for collective, organised warfare, who has been living as an individual wanderer for presumably years. They have not stopped. They have adapted. The tools they started with have been refined by circumstances they did not choose. They are a soldier who learned to survive without an army, which is a kind of competence that the original military training did not provide, something they built themselves through necessity. The vagabond's equipment tells us one more thing, and it is a small thing but worth noting. They carry a longsword as a secondary weapon alongside the halberd. The longsword is a more conventional, compact weapon, something to draw in close quarters when the pole weapon becomes unwieldy. That secondary option shows planning. The vagabond is not improvising. They have thought about what they might need, and they have prepared for the scenarios their primary weapon does not cover. This is a professional in the deep sense of the word, someone who takes their vocation seriously and maintains their capability deliberately, even when No one is watching, and there is no organization demanding it of them. That self-imposed discipline, maintaining standards for which there is no longer any external authority, is perhaps the most characteristic thing about the vagabond. The order they served is gone. The lord who would have demanded excellence from them is gone. The community that would have witnessed and evaluated their performance is gone. And they still maintain the armor. They still carry the secondary weapon. They still practice the techniques that the formation required. Because that is who they are, or because it is the only way they know how to keep being someone at all. Let us spend time on the concept of the tarnished, because it is essential to understanding every class in this video, and the vagabond is a good place to establish it fully. In Elden Ring, the tarnished are a specific category of people in the world's mythology. They were once people of the lands between, who held the grace of the Erd tree. The grace, in practical terms, is a kind of divine favour that connects a person to the life-sustaining power of the Erd tree. Those who hold it benefit from something close to immortality, in that their deaths are not permanent. They can be revived at sites of grace, the glowing anchors of Erd tree power scattered throughout the world. The grace also guides them, manifesting as golden wisps that point tarnished toward their purpose. At some point, for reasons the game only partially explains, the Erd tree began withdrawing its grace from certain people. These people became tarnished. They lost the protection, the immortality, the guidance. They became mortal in the conventional permanent sense, and they were exiled, cast out of the lands between into a wider, less defined outside world. The tarnished were scattered, and many of them died in obscurity, living shortened, ordinary lives far from the land they had once inhabited. Then the shattering happened. The Elden Ring broke. The world destabilized, and something like the grace, something that resembled it closely enough to feel real, began moving again. It began reaching out to the tarnished, calling them back. Not all of them heard it, presumably, but those who heard it and answered found themselves drawn back toward the lands between, toward the stranded graveyard at the edge of the world, toward a purpose that had not yet been named. What that purpose is, the game presents in the simplest possible terms at the opening. Become Elden Lord. Mend the Elden Ring. Restore what was broken, but the simplicity of the stated purpose covers an enormous amount of complexity in what that actually means, which is one of the game's central narrative engines. The tarnished are being called to fix something. But what it means to fix it, who benefits from it being fixed, what gets broken in the fixing, these are questions the game spends its entire length raising without providing clean answers. For the vagabond, being tarnished is a layered thing. They lost the grace at some point before the shattering, presumably. Then they spent time wandering in the outside world, exiled, mortal, without the guidance of the golden wisps. And now the grace is calling them back, or something is calling them back in the grace's name. That call would feel different to the vagabond than it might feel to, say, the astrologer or the prophet. The vagabond does not have the intellectual framework of a scholar or the spiritual framework of a devotee. They have a body and a weapon and a long memory of being a person who fought for something. The call of the grace is, to the vagabond, the closest thing to a cause they have had in years. Whether that is beautiful or alarming depends on how you feel about a person who has been directionless for years, accepting direction from a source whose intentions are unclear. The game does not tell you how to feel, but the vagabond's history makes the acceptance legible. After enough time without a cause, almost any cause looks like something worth walking toward. The stranded graveyard where the game begins is a transitional space, literally. It is a cave at the edge of the lands between, a liminal zone between the outside world, where the tarnished were exiled, and the world the game will open into. All 10 classes begin here, and the starting area functions as both a tutorial and a threshold. Crossing it means you're back. The lands between, which rejected you or lost you at some point, is receiving you again. For the vagabond, that crossing would be physically and emotionally significant in ways that the game does not dramatize, but that are there if you consider them. They are returning to a version of the world they once inhabited, a world they were once part of, carrying the same armor and weapons they have been carrying for years, alone. Whatever the lands between was when they left it, it is something different now. The shattering changed it. The demigods tore it apart. The places they might have known might not exist anymore, or might have become battlegrounds, or might be ruled by factions that have no connection to the order that once gave the vagabond their purpose. Coming home to find that home has changed beyond recognition is its own specific grief. The vagabond was already grieving the loss of their homeland and their lord. Now they return to find that the world those things were embedded in has also been transformed into something unfamiliar. They arrive, as all the tarnished do, as a stranger in a land that might once have been theirs, armed with skills developed for a world that no longer quite exists. The fact that they come anyway is everything you need to know about the vagabond's character. They have nothing left to lose, perhaps. Or they have something left, something small and stubborn, some version of the purpose that the knighthood once gave them, and they are walking toward it because walking towards something, however uncertain, is better than the alternative. Let us talk about some of the specific lore elements in the game that connect to the vagabond's background. Throughout the lands between, you can find wandering noble enemies, figures in tattered clothes, wandering without apparent purpose, and you can find vagabond knight enemies specifically, armed soldiers in the same armor the player, vagabond, wears, sometimes alone, and sometimes in small groups. These figures are not hostile by default in every encounter. Some of them simply stand there, and some of them attack only when provoked. They are the other vagabond knights, the ones who also survived, who also wandered back, who also found themselves in the lands between without a clear purpose. The player's vagabond is distinguished from them not by their equipment or their background, but by the fact that they have the grace. The golden light chose them rather than the wandering knight, standing passive in a field. That distinction between the tarnished chosen by grace and the tarnished who wandered back on their own is one of the game's quieter moral questions. What makes one person chosen and another not? The game does not give you a satisfying answer. The grace chose who it chose. The wandering knights in the field were not chosen. The vagabond player character was. The reason for that selection, if there is a reason, is one of the threads the game leaves deliberately untied. The vagabond's connection to the wandering noble and vagabond knight enemies also raises a question about what could happen to them if the grace were to fail, or if they failed in their purpose. Those wandering figures in the field are not particularly threatening in themselves. They are defeated and moved past, but they represent a future the vagabond might have had if they had not been called, or a future they might still have if they lose their way. Without the grace, without the purpose the game's main quest provides, a vagabond knight is just another wandering figure in a world full of them. The game is populated with its own cautionary examples, and the vagabond starts equipped to see themselves in them. The vagabond's high starting level relative to some of the other classes is worth noting. They begin at a level that reflects more total stat points invested than several of the other classes, which translates to being slightly ahead at the very opening of the game. That head start is not dramatic, but it reflects the vagabond's background. A professional soldier who's been practicing their craft through years of wandering has not lost their edge. They have maintained it. They arrive ready to fight in a way that some of the more specialized or unusual classes might not be at the very outset. As a final thought on the vagabond before we move to the next class, I want to return to something I raised at the beginning. The armor set is named for a type. The vagabond knight set is not this specific character's armor. It is a category. There are enough wandering knights in this world that their armor has a collective name, and that collective weight means the vagabond's story is not just personal, it is representative. They carry the grief of everyone who built their identity around an order that no longer exists. Every wandering knight in every empty field is another iteration of the same broken story. The player's vagabond is the one that answered the call, the one the grace selected, the one who gets to do something with the grief rather than simply carrying it forever. Whether they succeed and what success looks like is what the rest of the game is for. The warrior? The warrior's first distinguishing feature is visible before you read a single word of their description. Where the vagabond presents a heavy silhouette, armoured and substantial, the warrior presents something completely different. They are lean, light, wearing leather and fabric rather than plate, and they carry 2 weapons, where the vagabond carries 1 weapon and a shield. The warrior's posture suggests readiness of a different kind. Not endurance, not stability, but the coiled potential of someone who moves fast and hits first. The game describes the warrior as a nomad warrior who wields 2 blades. 5 words of history: nomad, warrior, 2 blades. Each one is doing specific work. Nomad is the word I want to start with, because it is the word that most distinguishes the warrior from the vagabond, whose parallel descriptor might be wanderer. Both words describe movement without a fixed home, but the resonances are different. A wanderer is someone who moves because they have lost the place they belonged. The word carries displacement, absence, something missing. A nomad is someone whose culture and identity, an entire way of organizing life, is built around movement itself. Nomadic cultures are not failed settled cultures. They are their own thing, their own answer to the question of how to live, with their own internal logic, their own traditions, their own deep knowledge of the territory they move through. The warrior is not homeless in the way the vagabond is homeless. The vagabond had a place and lost it. The warrior comes from a people for whom place was never the organizing principle. Their home was the movement. Their community was defined by the group that moved together, not by the territory they happened to occupy at any given moment. That distinction matters for how we understand the warrior's exile as a tarnished. When the tarnished lose the grace and are cast out of the lands between, the experience of that exile depends heavily on what home meant to you. For the vagabond, exile means losing the specific place and structure that gave them identity. For the warrior, exile might be different. If your entire culture was already structured around movement, if you were never defined by a fixed territory, then the outside world might simply be another territory to move through. Difficult, certainly. Harsh and hostile, probably, but not the same kind of rupture that the vagabond experienced. The warrior starts with 2 scimitars, both of them curved swords with short, elegant blades. Scimitars in Elden Ring scale with dexterity and deal slashing damage with fast, fluid attacks. They are not powerful in the way that a great sword or a battle axe is powerful. They are effective through speed and consistency, through the accumulation of many quick cuts rather than the landing of few massive blows. The dual scimitar fighting style requires more precise control than single weapon fighting, because each hand is doing something different at different moments. The right hand commits to a slash, while the left hand sets up the next attack. The rhythm of it, when it is working properly, is almost like a conversation between the 2 weapons. To fight well with 2 weapons, you need a body that can maintain separate control of 2 limbs at high speed, and a mind that can track both the enemy's position and your own movements simultaneously. The warrior has been doing this long enough that it is not a conscious calculation anymore. It is instinct, trained instinct, developed through years of practice within a tradition that considered this style of fighting worth developing and passing on. The warrior's starting stats lean toward dexterity and endurance, with a reasonable vigor and relatively low investment in everything else. The dexterity is the highest starting score, which in Elden Ring represents technical precision and speed rather than raw force. The endurance supports the sustained movement that dual wielding demands. The vigor gives them enough health to survive the hits they cannot avoid. and the near absence of anything else reflects a character whose entire capability is physical and technical, built through practice and tradition rather than through magical study or divine connection. The warrior set is a study in practical construction. The chest piece is leather reinforced at stress points. The arm wraps are functional rather than ornate. The leg wraps provide protection without sacrificing the full range of motion. All of it assembled to serve the specific demands of a fast, movement-based fighting style. None of it made by an institutional armourer for a knight in service to a great lord. All of it the product of a tradition that developed equipment to answer specific real-world questions about survival. What keeps you alive when you're always moving? What protects you when you're always lightly armoured by necessity? What can you wear when you cannot carry anything heavy, because carrying heavy things interferes with covering the distances you need to cover? The round shield the warrior starts with is the smallest defensive item in the game's arsenal. It is about the size of a dinner plate. It would provide minimal coverage against a full-force blow from any of the serious threats in the lands between. Its primary function is parrying, the high-precision technique of catching an attack at exactly the right angle and moment to redirect it entirely. The warrior is not looking for coverage. They are looking for moments, openings, the instant of vulnerability that a parry creates, which can then be exploited with a critical strike from one of the scimitars. A small shield used for parrying is, in the context of the warrior's dual weapon style, not a compromise. It is an extension of the same philosophy, fast, precise, timing dependent. You do not block the attack. You answer it, and your answer is the continuation of the fight on terms more favourable to you. Let us think about what kind of culture produced the warrior. Nomadic warrior traditions in real-world history have several common characteristics that are relevant here. They tend to develop exceptional individual fighters because, in communities that move and face unpredictable threats, individual capability matters more than in settled communities that can sustain large institutional armies. They tend to develop deep expertise in specific weapons and techniques, because those weapons and techniques are passed down through close community relationships, rather than formal institutions. And they tend to develop a different relationship to territory than settled cultures, seeing the land as something to move through and use rather than something to own and defend. In the world of Elden Ring, the dominant power, the Golden Order, was a settled institutional culture. It had its academies and its temples and its armories and its formal military traditions. The space for nomadic cultures in that world would have been the edges, the places where the Erd tree's light was thinner and its governance more nominal. The steppes beyond organised kingdoms, the wilderness regions that no one claimed formally, the in-between spaces that settled power found useful to ignore. The warrior's culture, whatever it was specifically, inhabited one of those spaces. They were, by the structural logic of the lands between, a peripheral people. Not subordinate to the Golden Order, perhaps, but certainly not central to it. Their traditions and their power were their own, developed in relationship to a world that the Order had not fully absorbed. Their fighting style, their weapons, their code, all of it emerged from that periphery rather than from the centre. When the Golden Order began withdrawing grace from the tarnished, the warrior would have been among those affected. But as I suggested earlier, the experience of that withdrawal might have been different for someone from a culture that was never fully invested in what the Golden Order represented. The grace was one source of power in a world that had other sources. The warrior, if their culture had any relationship with forces other than the Erd tree, might have had resources to draw on that the vagabond lacked. This is a speculative reading, but the warrior's notably high starting dexterity supports it in a narrow way. Dexterity in Elden Ring is not only a measure of speed, it also contributes to spell-casting speed for sorceries and incantations, even for characters not primarily focused on magic. There is something in the dexterity stat that speaks to a certain kind of attunement, a sensitivity to the precise moment that extends beyond simple physical speed. The warrior's extreme investment in this attribute might suggest a people who developed their own understanding of timing and perception, their own relationship with the rhythms of the world. That is not magical in the glintstone or faith-based sense, but is not entirely physical either. The warrior's minimal faith score is one of the more telling absences in their stat sheet. Among the physically oriented classes, the vagabond at least started life in a structure where faith and martial service were intertwined. The warrior has essentially no connection to faith magic at all. Whatever their culture's relationship with the divine might be, it does not express itself through the Golden Order's theological framework, and therefore it does not map onto the incantation system that framework governs. This does not mean the warrior has no spiritual life. Many nomadic cultures have rich and complex spiritual traditions, but those traditions operate through channels that the Golden Order's systems do not recognize and cannot quantify. The warrior might have a deep relationship with ancestral spirits, with natural forces, with the rhythms of season and territory that their culture moved through. None of that shows up on the stat sheet because the stat sheet measures the categories the game's world recognizes as power. What falls outside those categories is invisible to the measurement. The warrior's dual scimitars have something else worth noting, which is that curved swords in Elden Ring often carry a passive bleed build-up. Bleed in this world is a combat effect with its own lore implications. It accumulates with each wound, and when enough blood has been lost, there is a sudden burst of damage, representing catastrophic hemorrhage. The effectiveness of bleed as a technique depends on sustained, repeated attacks, on maintaining pressure and continuing to cut rather than stopping to line up a single, decisive blow. As a fighting philosophy, this is the scimitar tradition in a nutshell. The warrior does not try to end things in a single decisive moment. They apply pressure. They accumulate advantage through consistency and precision. They keep moving and keep cutting, and eventually the accumulated effect overwhelms the target's ability to continue. This is not flashy. It is patient and relentless, which in a fighter is often more dangerous than impressive. The warrior's tarnished status and their return to the lands between is an interesting moment to consider. For a nomad, the concept of return is complicated. You do not return to a place you were in the way a settled person returns home. You return to a territory. The lands between was a territory the warrior's culture either moved through or adjacent to, and now they are moving through it again. The conditions have changed. The territory is more dangerous, more chaotic, more broken. But the fundamental mode of engagement, moving through, reading the terrain, adapting to what you find, is one their tradition has prepared them for. The grace, if the warrior experiences it at all as guidance, might be received as a kind of signal from the territory itself. The land is calling for something. The land has a need. The nomad's relationship with territory often includes a reciprocal dimension, the understanding that you take from the land, but also give back to it, that your presence and your movement are part of a larger pattern. Answering the Grace's call might, in the warrior's cultural framework, be something very close to answering the land's need. It might not feel like divine summons at all. It might feel like the natural next step in a long, ongoing relationship between a moving people and the world they move through. There is one more aspect of the warrior that I want to address before moving on, and it is the question of community. Of all the classes described so far, the warrior is the one most explicitly defined by a cultural context that extends beyond the individual. The vagabond had institutional context, a knightly order, but institutions can be dissolved and their members dispersed. A nomadic culture, while it can be scattered, carries its knowledge and traditions in the people who practice it rather than in buildings or documents that can be destroyed. The warrior carries their culture in their body, in the muscle memory of two-weapon fighting, in the reflexes that come from a lifetime of practicing a tradition, in the instincts that were developed by a community that understood survival as something taught between generations, rather than imposed by external authority, even exiled, even alone in the lands between. The warrior brings with them an entire inheritance of practiced knowledge and community wisdom, compressed into a body that knows how to move and how to fight in a particular way. That is not nothing. That is, in many ways, more portable and more resilient than the kinds of inheritance the more institutionally defined classes carry. The vagabond's nightly training is only useful if there is something to use it in service of. The warrior's tradition is self-sufficient. It asks nothing of the world except that it be survived. Let us move to the hero. The hero. There is a tension built into the hero from the moment you read the name. Hero is a word that carries enormous freight. It implies a story, a narrative of significant deeds, a figure who matters to others because of what they have done or what they represent. And then the game's description complicates this immediately. The hero is not themselves a celebrated figure of great deeds. They are a descendant of one, or of several. Their connection to significance is inherited rather than earned. They are the latest in a line, not the apex of it. The game describes the hero as a descendant of an ancient dynasty with a powerful build and deeply experienced in the use of the battle axe. Descendant. Ancient dynasty. Powerful build. Deeply experienced. These words paint a picture that is simultaneously impressive and melancholy. The dynasty is ancient, which means it is in the past. The descendant is powerful, which means the bloodline still carries something. The experience with the battle axe is real and present. But the dynasty itself, whatever it was, is no longer at the height of its power. The hero carries its echo. The battle axe is the first weapon we should think about carefully. In the hierarchy of weapons in the world of Elden Ring, the axe occupies a particular place. It is not the refined tool of the duelist, not the elegant expression of a martial art. It is a blunt instrument in the most direct sense of the word, a piece of metal at the end of a handle designed to hit things as hard as possible. Axes in their origin are working tools. They cut wood. They were only secondarily adapted for combat. And they were adapted for combat in cultures where the priority was devastating force, rather than technical refinement. The battle axe scales primarily with strength, Elden Ring's stat for raw physical power. There is no subtext in a strength weapon. There is no finesse being cultivated, no precise technique being rewarded. The strength stat rewards the ability to move large, heavy things quickly through space, and the battle axe is the clearest expression of that. The hero can hit extremely hard from the very beginning, at a level that no other starting class can match. That hitting power is connected to the ancient dynasty in a way worth tracing. The game is full of examples of lineages that carry power in their blood in literal, physical ways. The demigods are the most obvious examples, beings of near-divine capability, whose power derives from their heritage, rather than their individual achievement. But there are subtler versions throughout the world. Warrior clans whose members are physically exceptional. Communities with hereditary aptitudes that express as unusual strength or endurance or resistance to magic. The hero's extreme strength might be of this type, a biological inheritance from a people whose power was always expressed physically, whose ancient dynasty was built on physical dominance and carries that dominance forward in the genes of its descendants. Even as everything else about the dynasty has diminished, the champion set that the hero wears tells a parallel story. It is described in the game as the attire of a champion, a fighter who represented something greater than themselves in their battles. The word champion carries that representative quality, A champion does not fight for personal glory alone. A champion fights on behalf of a people, a cause, a name. Their victories belong to whoever they represent. Their defeats are not personal failures, but shared ones. The head bandage is the most specific piece of the champion set, and it is oddly intimate for a piece of armour. Most head protection in the game is a helmet, something hard and covering. The bandage is neither of these things. It is a cloth wrapped around the head, a medical dressing, something you use when a proper helmet is not available, or when the wound beneath it is still being managed. A champion who wears a bandage rather than a helmet has been in enough fights that wounds have accumulated faster than recovery allows. They are going into the next battle, still healing from the last one. That is not weakness. That is the specific condition of someone for whom the fighting never really stops. The large leather shield the hero starts with is their most significant departure from pure offensive capability. It is a larger shield than the heater the vagabond carries, providing more coverage and better stability. With the hero's high strength, they can hold it firmly, even against powerful blows. But the shield is also less suited to the parry-focused techniques the warrior might employ. The hero does not primarily look for openings through technical timing. They generate openings through force, by hitting hard enough that the opponent is too occupied with the damage to maintain their own attack rhythm. There is a philosophy of fighting here that is worth articulating. The hero's approach says, I am going to hit you harder than you're going to hit me, and if I am wrong about that, the shield will keep me in the fight until I am proven right. It is a confident approach. It demands a kind of fundamental self-assurance about one's own capability that is either born or developed through a long history of being the strongest person in every room. Let us explore the ancient dynasty more carefully. The word ancient in Elden Ring's context is specific. The game distinguishes between different historical eras, and ancient refers to the very deep past, the time before the Golden Order's dominance, before the Erd tree grew to its full prominence. There are references throughout the game to civilizations and peoples who existed in the Crucible Age, the era when the primal life force called the Crucible was more openly accessible, and when the world was organized differently than it became under Marika's reign. The Crucible is one of the most fascinating concepts in the game's mythology. It is described as the primordial vitality from which all life descends, the tangled, branching, endlessly growing essence of existence before it was shaped and refined by the Erd tree's organizing principle. The Erd tree, in one reading, represents a kind of selection and ordering of the Crucible, a narrowing and purifying of life's possibilities into a hierarchy. The Crucible before the Erd tree's dominance was wilder, stranger, more proliferative. Certain beings and warriors in the game carry what are called Crucible aspects, residual physical characteristics of that older era, scales, tails, wings, features of animals, and creatures integrated into otherwise human forms. An ancient dynasty rooted in the Crucible era would produce descendants with extraordinary physical vitality, an excess of the primal life force that the Crucible represented. That excess would manifest as size, as strength, as a constitution that absorbs damage and keeps functioning where a more ordinary body would stop. The hero's high vigor and extreme strength might be the physical expression of a heritage that predates the Erd tree's refinement of life. They carry something older than the Golden Order in their body, something that does not answer to the Erd tree's logic, but is powerful in its own right. This reading raises an interesting question about the hero's relationship to the Golden Order and its institutions. If the dynasty they descend from predates the Order's dominance, and if that dynasty carried its own source of power rather than the grace of the Erd tree, then the hero might have a complicated relationship with the theological and political structures that organized the lands between during the age of the Golden Order. They might have been tolerated at the margins of that order, allowed to exist because they were powerful and therefore useful, but never fully integrated into the divine hierarchy the Erd tree represented. Being tarnished for the hero might carry a different weight than for the vagabond. The vagabond was part of the Golden Order and was expelled from it. The hero, or their dynasty, might have always had an ambivalent relationship with the order that gave the grace. Losing the grace might have confirmed something that the dynasty always suspected, that the Erd tree's order was not their natural home, that they were always going to be adjacent to it rather than inside it. The hero's minimal faith is, in this reading, not a wound the way it might be for the vagabond. It is a baseline state. They were never deeply connected to the Erd tree's grace, never built their identity around it the way a knight of the Golden Order would have. The loss of it was less traumatic because the dependency was less total. What the hero does carry, the thing the dynasty passed down that the Erd tree could not take away, is the body. The bone structure, the muscle density, the constitution that turns eating and sleeping and training into something closer to a force of nature than an individual capability. The dynasty's power lives in the flesh of its descendants, and the hero carries more of it than most. Let us think about what the hero does with this inheritance in the context of the lands between. They arrive with a battle axe and a shield and a body built for fighting, carrying the name and the blood of a dynasty that most people in the current age probably do not remember. Whatever claims their bloodline once had to power or territory or recognition are gone, not burned away by the shattering specifically, but eroded over the long centuries of the Golden Order's dominance, during which older dynasties were gradually subsumed, forgotten, or reduced to marginal status. There is something quietly political about the hero's presence in the lands between at this particular moment. The shattering has destabilized everything. The structures the Golden Order built are fracturing. The demigods who inherited Marika's world are fighting each other into exhaustion. The old hierarchies are tearing apart. In that chaos, someone carrying an ancient bloodline, someone with power that predates the current age's organization, might find something here that was not available to them before the shattering. Not a claim to be asserted, not necessarily, but a relevance that the old order had obscured and the new chaos has opened back up. Whether the hero sees it that way, whether they are motivated by any sense of dynastic renewal or simply by the immediate practical imperatives of survival and the grace's call, is a question the game leaves open. But the possibility that this ancient lineage of warriors might find more relevance in a broken world than they had in an ordered one is one of the more interesting lore implications attached to this class. The battle axe the hero wields has a swing pattern that commits the user. Slow wind-up, powerful impact, the moment during the recovery, after the swing, where you're open to retaliation. Fighting with a heavy axe requires a kind of courage, the willingness to be momentarily vulnerable in exchange for the potential of a devastating blow. You cannot take it back once you start the swing. You have to trust that the power of the impact will justify the risk of the wind-up. That commitment, the willingness to swing hard and trust the power, is perhaps the most characteristic thing about the hero as a fighter. They are not subtle, they are not particularly evasive, they hit hard and they trust the hitting. And in the world of Elden Ring, where many of the most dangerous encounters are won by the character who can absorb the most punishment while dealing the most damage, trusting the hitting is often the right call. The hero is, in summary, a character caught between two kinds of significance. The significance of what their bloodline was, which is ancient and impressive, but now mostly invisible and irrelevant, and the significance of what they themselves are, which is powerful and present and very real. The dynasty gave them the body. What they do with it in the lands between is entirely their own. Let us move to the bandit. The bandit. The bandit is the first class in this video whose description is explicitly morally unflattering, and the unflattering quality of it is not an accident. The game describes them as a dangerous bandit who preys upon fellow tarnished, not a former bandit, not someone who became a bandit reluctantly through circumstance. A bandit, present tense, whose defining activity is preying on members of their own category. The people they would naturally have the most in common with, the tarnished, are also the people they have been robbing. That specificity in the description matters. It would have been easy to write the bandit as someone who preys on travellers, or on merchants, or on the unprepared. Making the target specifically fellow, tarnished adds a dimension of community betrayal that elevates the bandit's moral status above simple criminality into something more complicated. It is one thing to rob a stranger. It is another to rob the people who share your exile, who understand your situation from the inside, who are already vulnerable because of what the world did to all of you. The bandit starts with a dagger, a short bow, and a buckler. Their armour is the bandit set, leather dyed in dark tones, with a hood pulled forward to shade the face. They carry great arrows for the bow rather than standard ones. The entire loadout is oriented toward one specific combat strategy. Get to a position of advantage without being detected. Strike first at range. Follow up with a close-range critical when the enemy is vulnerable. Get away if the situation turns bad. The dagger is the critical piece of this equation. Daggers in Elden Ring have a specific mechanical relationship to critical attacks, the finishes performed after a successful parry or a backstab. Most weapons deal critical damage at a multiplier of the base damage. Daggers have a higher critical multiplier than almost any other weapon category, and some daggers have passive effects that enhance critical damage further. What this means is that the dagger is not designed for fair fights. It is designed for the moments after a fair fight has been destabilized, after the opponent has been surprised or outmaneuvered, after the bow has done its work. The dagger finishes what the bow started. The short bow is the setup tool. Great arrows hit harder than standard arrows, which means the bow can do real damage at range, not just nuisance damage that barely registers against a serious target. The bandit has invested in ammunition quality, which reflects a certain professionalism even in their methods. They have thought about what they need from their ranged attack. It needs to actually threaten the target, to create damage that matters, because the bow shot is not just a prelude. Sometimes the bow shot needs to do the job on its own. The buckler is the smallest shield in the game and is primarily designed for parrying. Like the warrior's round shield, it is not used for covering defense. It is used for interception, catching an attack at precisely the right moment. The bandit wants the parry for the same reason a professional gambler wants a read on their opponent. The parry is the moment when you take control of the encounter, when the target's momentum becomes your advantage. The devastating dagger critical that follows is the payoff of that control. The bandit's starting stats are built around arcane above all else. This is the most unusual starting emphasis in the game. Arcane is the rarest high investment stat at the starting point, and for the bandit to lead with it tells us something that the surface level description of a thief or criminal would not immediately suggest. Arcane in Elden Ring governs item discovery, the passive chance of finding materials and items from defeated enemies, and it also scales several specific weapons and magical catalysts. But its more interesting dimension is what it implies about the character's perceptual relationship with the world. Arcane in several of the game's connected systems represents sensitivity to things hidden, to the occult dimension of the world, to forces and energies that are not readily visible. A character with high arcane perceives the world differently than one who does not. They notice things. They find things. Their awareness extends into registers that most people's does not. For a bandit, this arcane perception is a professional asset. Knowing when someone is coming before they arrive, sensing whether a potential target is more dangerous than they appear, reading the hidden dimensions of an environment to find the exits before you need them. The bandit's arcane sensitivity is not magical in the showy, effect-producing sense. It is practical. It keeps them alive. But there is a more interesting dimension to the arcane stat that emerges from the game's deeper lore. Arcane is associated with several things that are spiritually and cosmologically significant in the lands between. The dragon communion, for instance, which allows a character to eat the hearts of dragons and gain their powers, scales with arcane. Certain occult weapons, those that channel dark and hidden energies, scale with arcane. The Mohgwyn dynasty, associated with blood magic, and the god of blood Mog, whose power is fundamentally arcane in nature, connects to this stat. And perhaps most significantly, arcane is associated with discoveries, with finding things that are hidden, with accessing the parts of the world that have been deliberately obscured. A bandit who has been surviving in the outside world by taking from others might have developed this arcane sensitivity through years of necessity. They learned to find the hidden things because the hidden things were where the survival was. The merchant's concealed purse, the traveller's secondary pack, the abandoned cache that others had not noticed. The bandit's arcane is the stat expression of a lifetime of looking harder than everyone else for things that were not supposed to be found. The specific note that they prey on fellow tarnished deserves more attention. Why tarnished specifically? One possible reading is practical. The tarnished are a known category of target. They tend to have equipment, because equipment is what you need to survive. They tend to be travelling alone or in small groups, because the tarnished's existence is fundamentally isolated. And importantly, they are harder to kill permanently than ordinary mortals, because the grace or its echo sustains them. A bandit who preys on tarnished is operating in a peculiar economy. Their targets are recoverable. The tarnished they rob today might be on their feet again tomorrow. In a long enough time frame, the bandit might be able to rob the same people repeatedly. That is an extraordinarily cold way of looking at your fellow exiles, but survival has its own logic, and the outside world where the tarnished were exiled is not a friendly place. Resources are limited, competition is fierce, and the tarnished, with their near immortality, might be less sympathetic targets than ordinary mortals in the bandit's calculation. Robbing someone who will die permanently from the experience is different from robbing someone who will shake it off and continue. Whether that distinction justifies the bandit's activities or merely makes them less completely damning is a question the game does not answer. There is something worth saying about the psychology of someone who has operated this way for years. You cannot prey on your own community indefinitely without developing a particular set of cognitive habits. You have to become skilled at not thinking of them as your community. You have to be able to look at a tarnished exile and see a target rather than a fellow sufferer. That is a form of dissociation that requires practice and has costs. The bandit, over their years of operation, has almost certainly developed a certain emotional detachment from the category of person they inhabit. They know how to not feel the solidarity that their shared tarnished status might otherwise produce. That detachment is itself a survival mechanism of a particularly uncomfortable kind. The bandit in the lands between, called by the grace to do something entirely different, carries that detachment with them. It is part of their perceptual toolkit now. They will see the people they encounter, the NPCs, the factions, the potential allies and enemies, through the same arcane opportunistic lens they have been developing for years. What can be taken, where the exits are, who is more dangerous than they appear, and who is less. Whether that lens serves them well in the game's main narrative, which ultimately requires a kind of commitment, a willingness to align with something and fight for it, is an open question. The bandits' skills are extraordinary. Their perspective is, to put it generously, non-standard. What it produces in the lands between depends on what they choose to do with it. The shortbow deserves one more consideration. Shooting from range before closing is a fundamental ambush technique, and it reflects a specific philosophy of violence. The person who takes the first shot has chosen to define the terms of the encounter. They have decided unilaterally that this is now a fight, and they have given themselves the advantage of the opening move. The bandit does not wait to see if a situation will develop peacefully. They read the situation, make a determination about the most advantageous way to proceed, and act before the other party has the opportunity to do the same. In the lands between, this philosophy encounters a world in which almost everything is already hostile. The bandit does not need to create conflict. The conflict finds them. What they bring is the habit of managing it proactively, of refusing to be caught in a situation they did not define. In a world as dangerous as Elden Ring's, that habit might be exactly what the Grace was looking for when it called them. The bandit's starting dexterity is the second highest stat after arcane. This supports the dagger and bow approach, since both weapons benefit from dexterity, and it also suggests the kind of body the bandit has developed. They are fast, precise, and nimble. They do not have the raw strength of the hero or the endurance of the vagabond, but they do not need either. Their survival strategy has never been about absorbing punishment or delivering overwhelming force. It has been about precision and timing, and getting out before the situation deteriorates. The bandit arrives in the lands between, with skills that were developed in the worst possible context and for the least admirable reasons. But skills are transferable, and the least admirable reasons can become irrelevant once the context changes. A person who spent years finding the hidden thing, reading the hidden angle, taking the advantage before it was taken from them, might find in the lands. Between a set of challenges that are exactly the wrong shape for most other people and exactly the right shape for them. Let us move on to the astrologer. The astrologer with the astrologer, we make our first clear departure from physically oriented characters into a class whose primary capability is magical, and whose history is intellectual rather than martial. The shift is felt immediately in the visual design. Where the first four classes are all dressed for physical survival, the astrologer is wearing academic robes and an astronomically tall hat. They look as if they have arrived at a battlefield, having just stepped away from a library, which is in essence exactly what they have done. The game describes the astrologer as a scholar who left their academy and who wields sorceries as a result of their scholarly study. The most interesting word in that description is left, not expelled, not graduated, not sent away, left. This is a voluntary departure, or at least a departure framed as voluntary. The astrologer made a choice to be no longer at the academy. Why they made that choice is left entirely unspecified, and that unspecified reason is the most interesting thing about them. The Academy of Raya Lucaria is the game's primary institution for the study of sorcery, a vast castle complex in the Liurnia region, built on an island in a lake and staffed by scholars who have dedicated their lives to the study of glintstone magic. The Academy is one of the most significant locations in Elden Ring, both as a physical space the player explores and as a lore element in the world's history. It is also, when you spend time in it, a place of considerable moral darkness. The scholars there have extended their lifespans through glintstone research, have performed experiments on themselves and others, have pursued magical power with an intensity that crosses into obsession and cruelty. The Academy is brilliant and accomplished and deeply compromised. An astrologer who left the Academy is someone who walked away from that brilliance and that compromise. The question is which one they were walking away from. The astrologer's starting sorceries are Glintstone Pebble and Carrion Slicer. Glintstone Pebble is the foundational offensive sorcery of the Raya Lucaria tradition, a focused orb of glintstone energy launched at a target with speed and efficiency. It is not spectacular. It is practical, the result of years of study into the principles of magical force projection, condensed into the most reliable and economical form. A scholar starting their magical career would learn Glintstone Pebble the way an apprentice swordsman learns the basic thrust. It is the foundation on which everything more complex is built. Carrion Slicer is a more unusual starting spell. It creates a magical blade that strikes in a sweeping arc at close range, and it uses focus very efficiently relative to its damage output. It is a sorcery designed for emergency close-range situations, for when an enemy has gotten through the ranged barrier the astrologer prefers to maintain. It is, in a certain reading, the astrologer's answer to the question every mage faces. What do you do when something gets close enough to hit you? The answer is, you have a plan for that too. The combination of these two starting spells tells us something about the astrologer's academic training. They were taught practically as well as theoretically. Not just how magic works in principle, but how to apply it under pressure, how to maintain magical capability in scenarios that are not ideal. They were, or perhaps their instructors were, thinking about real-world application rather than purely abstract mastery. That practical dimension of their training is what distinguishes a scholar who can survive in the lands between from one who cannot. The glintstone staff the astrologer carries is their primary tool, the catalyst through which their spells are channeled. Staves in Elden Ring are not merely props, they are precision instruments, each with its own arcane characteristics that affect the sorceries cast through them. The astrologer starts with the most basic functional staff, adequate for their current repertoire, but with room to grow as their mastery develops. Using a staff rather than a catalyst seal is the immediate visual and mechanical marker of a sorcery tradition, as opposed to a faith tradition. The staff is the instrument of the scholar. The seal is the instrument of the devotee. The astrologer's starting stat distribution is dominated by intelligence and mind. Intelligence governs how powerful their sorceries are, scaling the damage of every glintstone spell they cast. Mind governs their focus pool, the magical resource that fuels casting. These are the two stats of a character who fights through sustained magical output, not through a single devastating spell, but through the consistent application of magical force over the course of an encounter. Their vigor and endurance are moderate, sufficient to survive the occasional hit, but not built to absorb punishment. Their strength and dexterity are minimal. This is a character who has invested almost nothing in physical capability, because their plan is to never be close enough to need it. The management of distance is not a secondary priority for the astrologer. It is the fundamental strategy around which everything else is organized. The blue-silver astrologer's shield the astrologer carries is a small square shield that is almost endearing in its inadequacy for serious defense. It has low stability and provides limited coverage. But it exists, and its existence says something. The astrologer knows they cannot always maintain distance. Sometimes the plan fails. Sometimes something gets past the spells. The shield is not a serious defensive option, but it is an acknowledgement that serious defensive options exist, and that the astrologer is aware of the problem, even if they have not fully solved it. Let us spend real time on glintstone as a substance and magical tradition, because it is the astrologer's entire world. Glintstone is described throughout the game as crystallized starlight, the residue of ancient stars, stones that fell from the sky in some earlier era and accumulated in the world, retaining within them a form of cosmic energy that trained scholars can access and channel. The stone itself is beautiful, a deep blue-violet crystal that emits a cold light. It is found in veins throughout the lands between, and it is the basis of an entire tradition of magic that the Academy of Raya Lucaria has spent centuries developing. The theoretical underpinning of glintstone sorcery is essentially astronomical and physical. The stars are not just lights in the sky in this cosmology, they are sources of power, massive concentrations of the same energy that is crystallized in glintstone, located at cosmic distances but connected to the world through the medium of that crystallized residue. When a sorcerer channels glintstone energy, they are drawing on starlight in a literal sense, accessing power that originated in objects billions of miles away and accumulated in the world over geological time. This is a fundamentally different theoretical basis from faith magic. Faith magic draws on the power of divine entities, whether the Eod tree or other gods, through a devotional relationship. The divine entity provides power and the devotee channels it. This creates a dependency. Your magical capability is tied to the god's willingness to supply it. Sorcery draws on impersonal natural forces that have no will and no agenda. The stars do not decide whether to give you their energy. You either have the knowledge and the skill to access it, or you do not. Nobody can take that access away from you by withdrawing their favour. For a scholar at the academy, this distinction between magic that depends on a relationship and magic that depends on knowledge is probably not just theoretical. The academy's complicated relationship with the Golden Order meant that scholars were always aware of the possibility that the Order might decide to restrict or prohibit their practice. That tension seems to have been a constant background hum in the academy's institutional life. The awareness that their power could be targeted in a way that a god's chosen could not. The astrologer's departure from the academy is placed in this context. What might prompt a scholar of genuine ability to walk away from the resources, the community, the library, the instruments, the peers, the institutional legitimacy of the academy? Several possibilities present themselves. A moral disagreement, perhaps over the experiments being conducted there, the extension of life through glintstone absorption, or the testing of sorceries on unwilling subjects. A discovery, perhaps something the astrologer found in their research that the academy did not want shared or pursued. A personal crisis, some realization about the nature of glintstone, or the academy, or themselves, that made continued membership impossible. Or something more mundane but still serious. A conflict with a specific faculty member or administrator. A political situation that made their position untenable. None of these are ruled out. The game's ambiguity here is not laziness. It is an invitation. The astrologer is whatever their reason for leaving makes them. An idealist who could not accept the academy's moral compromises is a different character from a renegade who is developing forbidden research. A disillusioned former believer in Glintstone's promise is different from someone who simply came to the end of what the academy could teach them. What we know is that they left with knowledge intact, and with sorceries they can still cast. Whatever the academy took from them, it did not take their understanding of Glintstone magic. They carry the tradition they were taught even without the institution that taught it. The astrologer set, the tall hat and robes, is worth dwelling on, aesthetically, for a moment. The hat is extravagant in a way that is purely academic, the kind of thing worn by someone who has specialized so intensely that they have lost some ordinary social awareness. It is a hat for stargazing, for looking up, for orienting yourself toward the sky, rather than toward the world at eye level. The robes are comfortable and designed for long hours of study, rather than for physical activity. The whole ensemble says, I live in my head. I am primarily concerned with things that are far away and very old. The immediate and physical concerns of the world require my attention only secondarily. In the lands between, as it currently exists, that hierarchy of concerns is a problem. The immediate and physical concerns of the world include giants and dragons and rotting knights and creatures that have been mutated by exposure to the various divine energies that have leaked out of the broken Elden ring. The astrologer's hat and robe suggest someone whose education prepared them for a world that no longer quite exists. The ordered, studious world of the academy, before the shattering, before the chaos. They are wearing the clothes of a time that is over, and yet their spells still work. The stars have not changed. Glintstone still holds the energy it always held. The knowledge the astrologer carries is still operational, still translates into actual force in the actual world. The hat might be a liability in the rain, but the glintstone pebble still flies true, regardless of what the caster is wearing. The astrologers' tarnished status connects them to a broader community of exiled scholars that the game hints at throughout its lore. Not all of the Academy's students and faculty would have been tarnished, but those who were would have faced the specific challenge of being both institutional and exiled, belonging to an organization that itself had a complicated relationship with the Golden Order, while also carrying the personal mark of having been rejected by the Erdtree's grace. The tarnished scholar is doubly outside the establishment. Their practice does not depend on the Erdtree, and their person has been rejected by it. Whether the grace calling the astrologer back is experienced primarily as a cosmic event to be studied, or as a genuine call to action, is probably the most interesting question about this character. The scholar's instinct, honed by years of training that treated all phenomena as data, is to analyze. What is this signal? What is producing it? What can the fact of its production tell us about the current state of the Elden Ring and the forces that are trying to repair or reshape it? Those are extremely good questions. The problem is that the lands between does not wait for the analysis to be completed before sending the next threat. The astrologer is, in one sense, the most overtly intellectual of the 10 classes, and that intellectualism is both their greatest asset and their primary vulnerability. They see the world through a framework of principles and patterns that was developed in a library and has been refined through years of magical practice. That framework is enormously powerful. It allows them to understand things that characters operating on pure instinct cannot access. But it is also a framework developed in relative safety, in the controlled environment of an academy and a scholar's solitary travels, not in the violent, chaotic, constantly dangerous environment of the lands between in its current state. The gap between what the astrologer knows and what the lands between demands they learn is the arc of their time in the world. Whether the scholar can make that adaptation without losing what makes them distinctive, whether the intelligence that drives their magical power can survive contact with a situation it was not designed for, is the story. Let us move forward to the prophet. The prophet and the astrologer are, in a meaningful sense, mirrors of each other. Both are characters whose primary capability is in the realm of the non-physical, the magical, and spiritual. But the astrologer's power is rooted in knowledge, in the intellectual mastery of impersonal forces. The prophet's power is rooted in faith, in a relationship with the divine that operates through devotion and reception rather than study and analysis. The astrologer goes to the power comes to the prophet. The game describes the prophet as a seer who was ostracized for being accused of spreading disaster. Every word of that description is working. Seer, ostracized, accused, spreading, disaster. Let us take them one at a time. Seer. A seer is someone with the ability to perceive things others cannot, specifically things about the future or about hidden truths. The seer tradition is one of the oldest in human storytelling, predating written records, existing in every culture that left traces. Seers are always described ambivalently, feared and respected, sought and avoided, invaluable and terrifying. The seer does not choose what they see. The visions come, and the visions are often about things that are dark and difficult, and that people would prefer not to know. Ostracized. This word is specific about the nature of the rejection. Not imprisoned, not executed, not simply ignored. Ostracized. The community collectively decided that this person could not remain among them. Ostracism is a communal act, requiring the participation of many people simultaneously. The prophet was not removed by a single authority. They were pushed out by a people who had made a collective determination, accused of spreading disaster. The accusation is spreading rather than causing. This distinction is important. Spreading disaster is different from causing it. If the prophet caused disasters, they would be a straightforwardly dangerous person, and the ostracism would be a practical safety measure. But spreading disaster suggests that the disasters were going to happen regardless, and what the prophet did was tell people about them. They spread the knowledge of disaster. They spread the fear of it, the anticipation of it, the preparation for it that might have looked, to those not prepared to receive the information, like an invitation or a summoning. This is the classic pattern of the rejected prophet in religious and mythological tradition across cultures. The person who sees the truth, who speaks it clearly, who refuses to soften it for palatability, and who is punished not because they are wrong, but because the truth is unwelcome. Cassandra in Greek mythology, Jeremiah in the Hebrew scriptures. The pattern is so universal, it has become an archetype. The seer who is correct and damned for it. The prophet starts with a short spear and a finger seal. The short spear is a humble weapon, a stick with a point, more suitable for maintaining distance from threats than for active martial engagement. For a character whose primary tools are divine incantations rather than physical combat, the short spear is the minimum viable physical option. It keeps things away, it buys time, it covers the gaps in the magical approach. The finger seal is the prophet's primary tool, analogous to the astrologer's staff but fundamentally different in what it represents. A seal in Elden Ring is a sacred object, specifically designed to channel incantations, the faith-based magic that draws on divine power. Using a seal means you are receiving power from somewhere outside yourself, from a divine source that is choosing to channel through you. You are the instrument, not the origin. The astrologer's staff says, "I am the source, the knowledge is in me, and I channel it outward." The prophet's seal says, "I am the conduit, the power is elsewhere, and I am open to receive it." These are profoundly different relationships to magical capability, with different psychological dimensions. The scholar controls their power through knowledge. The devotee's power depends on a relationship continuing. The prophet starting incantations, catch, flame and heal, establish this dual nature immediately. Catch flame projects a small explosive burst of fire. Heal restores health. The prophet can destroy and restore. They carry both capabilities from the very beginning, which is characteristic of the seer as a type. The person who tells you what is coming also knows how to help you survive it. The prophet of doom and the healer are in many traditions the same person. The fire of catch flame is worth thinking about carefully, because fire in Elden Ring has a complex and multi-layered significance. The Erd tree's fire is golden, the fire of holy order and divine life. The fire of the crucible, older than the Erd tree, is a more primal vitality. The fire of chaos, connected to the three fingers, one of the great outer gods, is a consuming, destructive force that some of the game's lore presents as a necessary counterweight to the Erd tree's order. An ordinary flame, the fire that burns things, predates all of these specific theological associations. The prophet uses fire as their primary offensive incantation. What kind of fire they are channeling, whose fire it is, whether the divine entity providing it aligns with any of the established theological frameworks of the lands between, is not specified by the starting choice. It might be the Erd tree's holy fire. It might be something more primordial. It might be something the prophet themselves does not fully understand, received in a vision as a gift, and wielded without complete knowledge of its source. The prophet's faith stat is the highest of any starting class. This is important because faith in Elden Ring is not just a resource, it is a relationship measure. Characters with high faith have, through some combination of devotion, practice, and natural attunement, developed a deep connection to the sources of divine power that incantations draw from. The prophet's extreme faith means they are, at the moment of the game's beginning, one of the most open to divine influence of all the tarnished. Whatever power is available through the incantation system, the prophet can access more of it, more directly than anyone else. That openness, that radical receptivity to divine influence is both a great gift and a significant vulnerability. The prophet is not just connected to beneficent divine powers. They're connected to whatever is available, whatever chooses to reach through the opening that faith creates. In a world where the divine has been fractured by the breaking of the Elden Ring, where multiple outer gods and demigod factions are competing for influence and for instruments through which to act, a very high faith character is a very open channel. The question of whose power flows through that channel is one the prophet may not always have the answer to. The prophet's set, the clothing the prophet starts with, is worn and simple. It is the clothing of someone who has been travelling for a long time without support, living from what could be gathered or begged or discovered along the way. There is no institutional endorsement in this outfit, no symbol of a church or a temple that would grant the wearer recognition and resources. The prophet was ostracized. The community that might have provided those resources rejected them. They have been surviving on their own, in the clothes they left in. There is a threadbare dignity to the prophet's visual presentation that is consistent with the ostracized seer archetype. They carry themselves with the bearing of someone who knows they are right, even though their community told them they were wrong, who maintains their conviction not because of external validation, but because the visions continue, because the divine connection persists, regardless of whether anyone around them acknowledges it. The prophet's relationship with the grace is, I think, unique among the 10 classes. Every other class experiences the grace as something new when they encounter it in the stranded graveyard, something that has been absent and is now present. For the prophet, whose entire existence is organized around receiving divine communications, the grace might not feel entirely new. It might feel like the most coherent and direct communication they have received in years, clearer than the partial and ambiguous visions they are accustomed to. Or it might feel like a continuation of a conversation that has been ongoing, the divine reaching out again, as it has before, saying, "Go somewhere, see something, do something necessary." Whether the prophet trusts this communication, given their history of receiving communications that ended in disaster and ostracism, is one of the more painful, open questions associated with the class. They were believed once, presumably, before the disasters they prophesied came true, and their community made them the scapegoat for those disasters. Being believed is not the natural state for a prophet. Being right and also blamed is. The grace is calling them back to do something. History suggests that doing the thing the divine asks of you and being recognized for it are not necessarily the same event. The prophet's high faith also means that, as the game progresses, their incantation capabilities can grow in ways that are more diverse than any other class. Faith-based magic in Elden Ring draws from multiple divine traditions. The Erd tree and its various expressions, the fire of the crucible, the powers of ancient beasts, lightning and holy energy, and rotten blood. The prophet can access all of these eventually, because faith is the key that opens every incantation door. Their breadth of potential is tied directly to the depth of their devotion, the openness of the channel they have spent their life developing. This breadth is, in the context of their ostracism, both ironic and fitting. The community that rejected them found their visions threatening because they were too comprehensive, too honest about disaster, too unwilling to soften the message. The magical expression of the prophet's faith is similarly comprehensive, unwilling to be confined to one tradition or one expression of the divine. They can channel anything they have the faith to receive, and their faith is deep enough to receive quite a lot. Let us move forward to the samurai. The samurai. The samurai is the first class in this video that introduces, without ambiguity, a culture from entirely outside the central geography and politics of the lands between. The game states this explicitly. They're a capable fighter from the distant land of reeds, who wields a katana and a longbow. That description grounds them geographically and culturally in a way that no other class description quite does. The Land of Reeds is a real place in this world, distant and inaccessible within the game's playable areas, but referenced and connected to through multiple characters and items. The Land of Reeds is not the lands between. It is somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the known borders of the game's map, described in ways that strongly evoke the aesthetic and cultural touchstones of feudal Japan without being a direct translation. It is a place with its own history, its own divine influences, its own tradition of warriors and their codes, its own relationship with death and honour, and the obligations one takes on when one commits to a cause. The samurai's starting equipment is the most complete and balanced of any of the physical classes. They carry the uchigatana, a katana that is one of the most refined weapons available at the game's starting point. They carry a longbow, a significantly more powerful ranged option than either the bandit's short bow. They wear the Land of Reeds set, a full armour ensemble that covers them thoroughly while maintaining mobility, and they carry a red thorn round shield that is, compared to the bandit's buckler or the warrior's round shield, a somewhat more substantial defensive option. The completeness of the samurai's loadout is itself a characterization. This is someone who arrived prepared. They thought about what they would need, and they have it. Every distance is covered. Every scenario has a primary tool. The longbow for enemies at range, the katana for close quarters, the armour for survival, the shield for interception. There is no significant gap in the samurai's starting capability that makes you immediately aware of what they're missing. That preparedness reflects a code that places enormous weight on readiness, on being equipped to handle any situation, not because the world is guaranteed to be manageable, but because the warrior's responsibility is to be prepared regardless. In traditions analogous to what the Land of Reeds seems to represent, the warrior's preparation is not just practical, it is moral. Being unprepared is not just a tactical failure, it is a failure of character, a dereliction of the duty that comes with the identity. The uchigatana is worth examining in detail. It is a katana, a single-edged sword with a slight curve, and it has specific characteristics in Elden Ring that distinguish it from straight swords. The katana's attack pattern is oriented toward fast, flowing strikes that can chain into combinations. The blade's slight curve means that many attacks are drawing cuts, slashes that travel along the edge as it passes through the target rather than blunt impacts. Drawing cuts are more efficient at creating wounds, which is relevant to the katana's passive bleed build-up. The Ash of War on the uchigatana is the unsheath skill, a stance-based technique that allows the user to enter a low guard position before launching either a fast draw cut or a powerful two-handed upward slash. The unsheath stance is immediately reminiscent of yaijutsu, the real-world Japanese martial art focused on the drawing cut, the strike delivered from the moment of unsheathing. This is a technique with deep cultural and philosophical significance in its original context. The speed of the draw, the single decisive cut, the return to the sheath. The idea that the perfect strike is the one that ends the fight before it properly begins. Carrying this technique into the lands between means carrying a philosophy of fighting that was developed in the Land of Reeds, and that has its own internal logic, its own requirements, its own understanding of what the sword is for. The samurai fights as they were trained. The code is in the muscles, in the reflexes, in the practiced form of the unsheathing. Wherever they are, whatever the context, the technique is theirs, and they bring it with them. The longbow is the samurai's secondary weapon, and the one most often overlooked in discussions of the class. It is a serious bow, more powerful than the short bow of the bandit, and with a significantly longer effective range. Combined with the samurai's starting stock of fire-tipped arrows, as well as standard arrows, the bow provides a genuine threat at range, rather than just a nuisance. The samurai can engage an enemy 50 meters away in a way that actually matters, not just to chip away at health, but to create real pressure that affects how the enemy behaves. The combination of longbow and katana makes the samurai the most self-sufficient class at multiple engagement ranges. They can choose the terms of an encounter in a way that few classes can. They can begin at range, whittle down an enemy's health and momentum, and then close the distance to finish with the katana. Or they can do it in reverse, pressing close with the blade and then creating distance to use the bow if the close-range fight does not go as planned. The flexibility of that combined approach is not just mechanical convenience. It reflects a warrior tradition that considered versatility essential, that did not assume any given encounter would occur on your preferred terms. The Land of Reeds set, the armor the samurai wears, is visually striking in a way that the other starting armors are not quite. It has a distinctive aesthetic that sets the wearer apart as someone from somewhere else, someone whose culture's visual language is different from the Golden Order's. The Lands Between's armor traditions tend toward either ceremonial plate for the knights and soldiers of established kingdoms, or practical leather and cloth for the wanderers and criminals and independent operators. The Land of Reeds armor does something different. It is both functional and aesthetically coherent in a tradition that has its own internal standards of what a warrior's equipment should look like. Wearing this armor in the Lands Between is a statement, though perhaps not an intentional one. The samurai is not trying to signal their foreignness. They are simply wearing the appropriate equipment for who they are. But the appropriate equipment for who they are is immediately legible as coming from somewhere else, as belonging to a tradition that the Lands Between did not produce. The samurai's stat distribution centers on dexterity and endurance, with solid vigor and moderate strength. The balance is more even than the other physical classes, and no single stat is as dramatically high relative to the others as the warrior's dexterity or the hero's strength. This balance reflects a martial tradition that demands comprehensive capability. A warrior of the Land of Reeds tradition cannot afford to be excellent at one thing and mediocre at everything else. The code demands overall excellence, the ability to be effective in any situation rather than devastating in one and helpless in others. The moderate strength means the samurai can use the katana effectively in two-handed configuration when needed, getting the full benefit of the weapon's weight without the limitations of one-handed use. The endurance supports both the sustained movement that fast combat requires and the carry weight needed to wear the Land of Reeds armor without being slowed. The vigor keeps them in fights that go long. Nothing is sacrificed. Everything is present. The samurai's minimal faith and intelligence scores indicate, as with the other physically focused classes, that their power is entirely in the physical domain. But where the vagabond's lack of faith reads as a loss and the hero's reads as a baseline state, the samurai's reads differently. The Land of Reeds has its own spiritual tradition, its own understanding of what connects a person to something greater than themselves. That tradition does not express itself through the Golden Order's faith magic system, which is what the faith stat measures, and it does not express itself through glintstone sorcery or any other arcane system the stat sheet can capture. It expresses itself through the quality of the fighting, through the commitment to the code, through the way the warrior carries themselves in the face of things that are very hard and very dangerous. This is a point worth dwelling on. In Elden Ring's system, power that cannot be quantified by the stat sheet is still power. The samurai bring something to the lands, between that does not show up in any of their numbers. They bring a tradition, a way of understanding what it means to be a warrior, a framework for making decisions about when to fight and how to fight and what the fighting is for, that was developed over generations in a place that has its own history and its own wisdom. That framework is not in any stat, but it is real, and it shapes how every encounter, every decision, every moment of danger is navigated. The samurai's tarnished status is worth considering specifically in the context of the land of reeds, geographic distance from the lands between. Being tarnished means you were exiled from the lands between when the grace left you. For someone from the land of reeds, what does that exile look like? They were not part of the lands between in the way that the vagabond was. They were from somewhere else. Did they come to the lands between at some point and then be sent away, making their tarnished status the record of a failed journey to a foreign place? Or were they tarnished in some way that extended across geography, the grace's withdrawal reaching them even in the land of reeds? The game does not specify, but the fact that tarnished from the land of reeds are a recognizable type in the world, multiple named characters and referenced warriors carry this background, suggests that the connection between the land of reeds and the tarnished is an established part of the world's history rather than an anomaly. Whatever relationship the two regions have, it produces warriors who arrive in the lands between carrying their code and their katanas and their willingness to fight for something, even when that something has not yet been defined. What the samurai finds in the lands between is a world that is, in many ways, familiar to someone trained in a tradition that takes the relationship between life and death seriously. The Land of Reed's tradition, as glimpsed through the characters who carry it in the game, treats death as something close, something present, something that shapes how you live, rather than something to be avoided by any means necessary. Dying well, dying in accordance with your commitments, dying as the final expression of who you chose to be, these are not unfamiliar concepts to the samurai. The lands between. After the shattering is a place absolutely full of death, in every form and variety. Death that has been made permanent by the rune of death's release into the world. Death that the demigods have turned into weapons. Death that accumulates in the places where the crucible's primal vitality has rotted into something else. The samurai is not naive about death when they arrive. Their tradition has prepared them for its presence. What the samurai may not be prepared for is the specific theological and political complexity of a world in which everything seems to be fighting over who gets to define what the Elden Ring means and what power over death and life that definition confers. The Land of Reed's tradition was shaped in a different context, with different stakes. The samurai's code tells them what to fight for. It does not tell them because it was not developed for this situation, which of the competing visions of what the world should become is worth fighting for. That gap between having a code and knowing how to apply it to an entirely new situation is the samurai's defining challenge in the lands between. They arrive fully equipped, fully trained, fully committed to a way of living and fighting. What they have to find is the cause that their commitment can serve, the purpose that their preparation was ultimately in service of, even if it was not the purpose the Land of Reeds had in mind when it produced them. Let us move to the prisoner. The prisoner is immediately the most visually distinctive of the 10 classes, and the distinctiveness is not decorative, it is structural. They wear an iron mask, not a helmet, an iron mask permanently affixed, covering the face. It cannot be removed without replacement. It does not provide meaningful protection. It is there because someone put it there, and the someone who put it there had the power and the will to make it permanent. The game describes the prisoner as someone who bears an iron mask that is clearly the work of a jailer, and who has the scholarly bearing of a practitioner of glintstone sorcery. The juxtaposition of those two things, jailer's mask and scholar's bearing, is the entire character. They were a scholar. Someone decided they needed to be contained. The containment was applied. The scholar continues to be what they are underneath it. The prisoner starts with an estoc, a thrusting sword, a glintstone staff, and the prisoner set, which consists of the iron mask, long arm shackles that are still attached to the wrists, prisoner's iron leg wraps, and basic garments underneath. The equipment is defined by restraint, by what has been placed on this person against their will and not removed. The estoc is a long, narrow, thrusting weapon designed to penetrate gaps in armor and to deliver precise stabs rather than broad slashes. It scales with both strength and dexterity and deals damage through dedicated thrusts rather than sweeping attacks. For a sorcerer who needs a reliable physical option for close quarters, the S-stock is an excellent choice. It is fast, it reaches further than a dagger, and it can be used in the same stance as a spell-casting staff in some situations. It is not a weapon that requires great physical investment to use effectively. It is a weapon that rewards precision and technique, both of which a scholar would have had the patience and intelligence to develop. The glintstone staff is the prisoner's casting tool, connecting them to the same tradition of academic sorcery as the astrologer. But where the astrologer has the astrologer's staff with its aesthetic of proud scholarly identity, the prisoner's staff is a more basic functional instrument. It is what was available, or what they could carry, or what they retained through the circumstances of their imprisonment and escape or exile. The iron mask is the piece of this that demands the most attention. Masks in the context of imprisonment and punitive justice serve several functions. They can serve as dehumanization, stripping the wearer of the individual identity that a face provides, reducing them from a person to a category. They can serve as silencing, preventing specific communications such as speaking certain words, casting vocal spells, identifying themselves to others. They can serve as humiliation, a visible marker of the wearer's status as a prisoner, a person who is contained and controlled. For a glintstone scholar, each of these functions has specific implications. Dehumanization in the context of a scholar is the attempt to reduce their academic identity, to deny that what they know and what they have studied makes them a particular kind of person with a particular kind of standing. Silencing a scholar who casts spells that might be vocal in nature makes tactical sense for a jailer concerned about magical escape attempts, and the humiliation of marking someone publicly as a prisoner would be particularly pointed for someone whose social identity was built around intellectual achievement and institutional standing. The iron shackles at the prisoner's wrists are still present, still attached, though presumably opened or broken enough that they do not prevent hand movement. They are a permanent reminder, or they have simply not been removed because the prisoner has been in too much danger or too much movement to stop and deal with them. They are there, heavy and visible, the physical weight of a captivity that has technically ended but has not been fully released. The scholarly bearing the description mentions is the most psychologically interesting detail. After everything, after the imprisonment, after the mask, after the shackles, after whatever the confinement involved in terms of conditions and duration, the prisoner still carries themselves like a scholar. The posture, the way they hold their body, the quality of their attention. These things persisted through the captivity. Whatever the jailer was trying to do, they did not succeed in taking this. The prisoner's stat distribution is interesting in the context of the astrologer comparison. Both are glintstone sorcerers with high intelligence. But the prisoner has lower intelligence than the astrologer, and they start with no specific sorceries, just the staff and the potential. This suggests a glintstone scholar whose development was interrupted, someone whose education or practice was cut off at a certain point, and who arrives at the beginning of the game having to rebuild from that point. The prisoner also has noticeably higher vigor than the astrologer. Not extreme, but meaningfully higher. They can absorb more physical damage. This is consistent with the physical experience of imprisonment, which is hard on the body. Confinement, possible mistreatment, the stress of a sustained difficult situation. Bodies either break under these conditions or they become more resilient. The prisoner's higher vigor suggests resilience, a body that endured what was done to it and emerged functional, even hardened. The prisoner's dexterity is moderate, supporting the S-stock and providing some incidental benefit for spell-casting speed. Their endurance is adequate, Their strength is enough for the stock without further investment. The physical stats tell the story of someone who maintained their physical capability through the constraints of captivity, not out of any particular passion for physical development, but out of the basic necessity of keeping a functional body available for when the opportunity for action arrived. Who imprisoned the prisoner? The most natural candidate, given that they are a glintstone scholar, is the Academy of Raya Lucaria, or some authority acting on the Academy's behalf. But it could equally be the Golden Order's ecclesiastical authorities, who had their own reasons for wanting to suppress certain kinds of sorcerous practice. Or it could be a specific demigod's forces, acting to contain someone whose knowledge or capability represented a threat to their interests. Each of these possibilities produces a different kind of prisoner. An academy-imprisoned scholar might be someone who pushed against the institution's accepted doctrines from the inside, a researcher who found something the administration wanted, suppressed, or who challenged the leadership in ways they found unacceptable. A Golden Order imprisoned scholar might be someone whose sorcery was deemed heretical in theological terms, someone whose study of the stars and glintstone energy led them to conclusions incompatible with the Order's cosmology. A demigod-imprisoned scholar might be someone who knew something specific and dangerous, someone whose knowledge of a particular aspect of the world made them valuable to capture and keep contained rather than simply eliminate. The specificity of the iron mask, described as clearly the work of a jailer, suggests something permanent and considered. This was not an improvised restraint. This was a crafted object made for a specific purpose, the long-term containment of a specific person. The jailer thought carefully about how to confine the prisoner, which implies they had reason to believe simple imprisonment was not sufficient. There was something the mask was specifically designed to prevent. Glintstone sorcery includes spells that are projected through gesture and will rather than through sound, so silencing the prisoner through a mask would not straightforwardly prevent sorcery. But it would prevent certain verbal communications, certain forms of teaching or sharing knowledge, certain things that the jailer did not want the prisoner doing. The mask is targeted at something specific about this person's capabilities or social role that the jailer found dangerous. The prisoner arrives in the lands between in a state that is defined by what was done to them, but not destroyed by it. The shackles are still on their wrists, but they are moving. The mask is still on their face, but they carry the staff. The prison clothes are still what they are wearing, but the scholarly bearing persists. They are the sum of what they were before and what was done to them, and neither part cancels the other. The grace called a prisoner, not a knight, not a scholar in the conventional sense, but someone who had been a scholar and been imprisoned for it, someone whose intellectual capability was matched by an experience of having that capability targeted and contained. That combination, the mind that was found dangerous enough to warrant an iron mask, is what the grace summoned back to the lands between. Whether the jailer who made the mask knows that the prisoner is now at large in the lands between, whether the forces that imprisoned them have any reach into the world the prisoner is now entering, whether the mask will ever come off, these are all questions the game leaves open. The prisoner's story is one that is still being resolved. The starting screen shows us the middle of it, not the beginning or the end. Someone was a scholar. Something went wrong. They are here now, in prison clothes and an iron mask, with a staff and a sword and whatever they still remember of the sorcery they studied before the confinement. That is enough to start with. The rest of the story happens in the lands between. Let us move to the Confessor. The Confessor is the class in this video that represents the most complete integration of faith and function, of spiritual practice and operational capability